It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor David Hackett Fischer, who is, in the thinking of many, I believe, perhaps our greatest historian of the mid-18th century. He's written a number of significant books: Albion's Seed, Washington's Crossing, to name only two. Sir.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, John, for that introduction, and thanks for everything you've done to make this gathering possible. It's been no small feat to bring all of us together, and I think we're all in your debt very much. John, Harvey. Let me make another introduction. The word "we" will frequently be deployed here, and "we" refers to Judy and me, and Judy is sitting over there in the side, the lady in red in the background. Judy's a biologist. I'm a historian. We've been biologizing and historicizing together since we met in graduate school and married 53 years ago. And it's a pleasure to be with you, and also to follow Gordon Wood, who spoke with you earlier today. Gordon also has been a friend of 50 years or thereabouts, and he'll be speaking tomorrow again on George Washington, and he's done much very interesting work on that subject. Well, my assignment from John was to tell you a story you've all heard before about Washington crossing the Delaware. It's an image that you've all seen before, and the image is on your tables, that painting by Lloyd of Washington in the boat. If you haven't been to the New York, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York recently, go there. The new American wing is open. At the very center of the American wing is that great painting, Lloyd's Washington crossing the Delaware. It's been beautifully cleaned, restored, remounted in a massive frame. And I think you'll be amazed to see it. Every time we visit, there's a crowd. It always brings a crowd. We were there, and there were an array of chairs in front of the painting. Every chair was filled with Japanese tourists who were getting a lecture on Washington's crossing, and they were absolutely absorbed in what they were seeing. You might take a look at that painting before you on your tables. It's what I want to talk about a little bit, not long. It's been a very long day for everybody, I think. But I want to talk about the relations between George Washington and the other people in that boat. Take a look at some of them if you haven't looked recently. It's a very mixed crowd who were there. There are many people who studied those images of people in the boat. There's one person who might be a woman. There were many women in these armies. General Howe's army had something like 3,000 women on the ration, as it was called. And they traveled often with their husbands and played a major role in what was going on. And I speculated when I brought my book out on Washington's Crossing, if in fact that was a woman. And then I got a letter, quite a lot of letters came in, some from Pietists who celebrated the painting, some from American iconoclasts who loved to debunk the painting. And I got a letter from a feminist debunker. And she said, "Look at that figure. Yes," she said, "it is a woman, and look closely. She's the only person in that boat who's actually rowing." And but the more we look at those people in the boat, the more interesting they become. Emmanuel Lloyd wanted to give us some sense of how diverse the Continental Army was that Washington commanded. And he represented it in the costumes, the dresses. You'll see the Virginia gentleman standing tall in the center of the boat, and farmers from Pennsylvania and Delaware. A gentleman from Maryland in his Continentals. A man from Massachusetts who was himself a slave in the tarpaulin jacket of the Marblehead Mariners. And Washington's job was to command that very mixed army. And what I want to talk about very briefly tonight is, first of all, the trouble that he got himself into, and then the way he got himself out of it. And I think there's something very important that happened there that we should continue to remember. Washington came from a very special part of this country. He came from the northern neck of Virginia. I think it was one of the more hierarchical parts of this republic. Much of it was owned by one family, an aristocratic British family, the Fairfax family, and the Washingtons worked for them, as did the Lees and the Marshalls and many others. It was an area that was so vast, the northern neck between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, that its size was measured in degrees of longitude, 3 degrees of longitude. And it was mostly dominated by that one family. It was very much top down. And Washington was a slave owner and a slave driver. And he lived in that world. And part of those Virginia gentlemen in that system of control of the county courts, that was the world in which he grew up. And then he was in the Continental Congress when he was elected unanimously to command the Continental Army. And he turned to Patrick Henry and he said, "Depend upon it, Mr. Henry, from this moment you may date the ruin of my reputation." And off he went to New England, and he wrote of New England as if it were a foreign country. He described New Englanders as a dirty and a leveling people, quote unquote. And they responded by inventing new verses of Yankee Doodle that are not sung by children today. And there was a mutual disdain that was felt there. And then things got even more complicated when the Backcountry Riflemen arrived from Virginia. Many of them were slaveholders. Next to them were New England regiments, which included many men who had been slaves. And when they first met, there were shouts and insults, which turned into blows. And then there was a full-scale riot that involved more people than the battles of Lexington and Concord. And Washington rode into the middle of this riot, and he grabbed 2 of the rioters, one in each of these enormous hands of his, and in the words of our source, he, quote, "talked to them," end quote. And he instantly ended that riot. But the question was how to make them into an army. And it got more and more difficult as he moved with that army to New York and faced the worst and most difficult challenge of his career. In 1776, the British made their major attempt to defeat the American Revolution. They sent more strength in troops and in ships to America than at any other point in the course of the Revolutionary War. Half of the Royal Navy was sent into New York Harbor. 2/3 of the British Army was sent to New York. And these were very expert soldiers, very good at their jobs, with long experience. We've been in the records of their muster rolls in the British Public Record Office. And the average time of service for privates in the British Army was 9 years. 9 years. They enlisted for life. The average time of service for many of those American troops was less than 9 weeks. And there were even greater differences in the experience of the officers. And then after these British troops arrived, in what I think was the largest extension of seaborne power in modern history, after that, there was another army that arrived with their Hessians. It's possible to get into those records and to discover that the Hessians, who've had a very bad press historiographically, were in fact also highly skilled professional soldiers. Their officers were, I think, unique in the 18th century in that so many of them had been to university. They'd been trained in technical institutes. They took great pride in their service and in their soldiers' honor, and I found them in their records very different from the characters that we have met. And Washington met these men. He did not want to fight for New York. He thought it was indefensible, but the Continental Congress was micromanaging the war at that stage, and Washington was ordered to defend New York. The New England Yankees, who came down with Washington, thought it would be a much better idea to burn New York to the ground and abandon it. But this was also vetoed. And so a campaign followed, which was a disaster for American arms. Everything went wrong. Discipline collapsed, camp discipline in American armies. And the toll in illness and mortality was enormous. That in the Civil War, there was, for every combat death, there were 2 deaths by non-combat causes. In the American Revolution, in the American Army, it was 8 to 1, 8 non-combat deaths for everybody in battle. And Washington's army began to melt away. He lost control of momentum. The Howe brothers, who I think turned out to be much better soldiers, William Howe, a better soldier, and his brother, a better admiral than they've been made out to be, were very skillful in getting control of what in the Pentagon today is called the tempo of war. They could control the flow of events, and they took Washington by surprise again and again. First, when they landed on Staten Island, then Long Island, then Manhattan, then up onto the mainland, and back to the Battle of Fort Washington, all in this period from midsummer to December of 1776. When it was all over, Washington was forced to retreat across the Hudson River. He'd started with an army of about 30,000 men, and as he retreated through Newark, he asked a young lieutenant of infantry, who was James Monroe, to stand by the side of the road and count his army. It had declined in numbers from 30,000 to 3,000 men. A large part of it was lost. It was lost at the siege of Fort Washington, just above what is now the George Washington Bridge on Manhattan. And Washington was standing on the Jersey Palisades as he watched those men being forced to surrender. And they also watched as some of them, under the 18th century laws of war, when one was fighting a rebel, a soldier could decide whether that rebel captive would live or die. And George Washington watched as his own men were put to the sword by their captor, some of them. And Washington, we are told, wept with tears of frustration, unable to do anything about this horrific sight that he was watching. And then he retreated across New Jersey, and as he went, the British followed at a distance. They didn't want to fight him again. They just wanted to get control of the countryside. And in the last weeks of November and in early December, they got control of large parts of 3 American colonies, New York, New Jersey, and also a good part of Rhode Island. And they issued an amnesty proclamation. General Howe sending it out in New Jersey, and something like 12% of the people of New Jersey signed that amnesty proclamation in November and December, often people who supported the Declaration of Independence. And many people thought that the American cause was broken, and it was only a matter of time before it would all be over. General Cornwallis packed his bags and prepared to go home, thinking that the war was over. George Washington wrote a letter to some of his relatives telling them to prepare to move west into the mountains because he thought that the cause might fail. And then the most amazing thing to me that happened was that as these men marched across New Jersey and then over the Delaware into Pennsylvania, something extraordinary happened. They decided to try again, and they reinvented the Army. And that's mostly what I want to talk about very briefly tonight. They began by thinking about what they always called the cause, the American cause. George Washington used that word frequently. And he was traveling across New Jersey with a journalist who was, as we would say, embedded with the Continental Army, and it was Thomas Paine. And he wrote the first of those pieces that he called the American Crisis that began, these are the times that try men's souls. And it was written mainly, I think, for the remnants of the Army. This was something new or very rare in history. It was an army of literate soldiers, and they were reading this restatement of the American cause and of its importance to the country and to the world. And then, as they settled into their camps across the Delaware in Pennsylvania, they began also to reinvent the Army in other ways. Washington found that he had to develop a new way of leading these people who were products of an open system, many of them. And he wrote home to his cousin, he said, people who are unaccustomed to restraint cannot be drove, they must be led. And he began to work out that idea of open leading for these free people. And he did it, first of all, by changing the 18th century institution that was called the Council of War. Every army had it. And I've been looking at the councils of war in the British Army. And this was a very narrow elite that ran the British Army. They'd been to the same schools. They called each other by their schoolboy nicknames. The council began with the general announcing the plan and then inviting everybody to discuss the way it would be put to work. George Washington began to do something different. He opened his councils of war with a problem. He invited others into his council of war. It was not a narrow and very closed elite. He invited civilians in who had some sort of knowledge that might be useful. Others were invited to come and contribute as well. It was in one way very controlled. Everybody knew who was in command of that army. But George Washington wanted it to be that sort of open process by which people could engage these free spirits who were used to being in control of their lives, to be part of the decision-making process. And all of that began to make a difference. One thing he did also was to change the relations with the Continental Congress, which was extremely difficult. These two first American national institutions, the Congress and the Army, had trouble getting on together. And Washington sent Nathaniel Greene to talk with the Adamses and others. And in November, as they were planning their next military operations, they also worked out a deal, understanding, compromise with the Continental Congress. The understanding was that Congress was supreme. They represented the sovereignty of the people. But the generals would run the war. And all of that was agreed on both sides. It was a very difficult idea that it kept coming apart. But they began to make that work, and it was a different basis. As there was no other national government except the Congress, Washington also maintained that huge correspondence with every governor of all the American states. And it was about building a logistical network, a new kind of network. It was a web of relationships. And if some part of it got broken by British opponents, the web itself would survive. And the supplies began to flow again, and a few men as well into Washington's army. He worked out a new system of intelligence, which had broken down totally in New York. And what he did was to ask all of his major generals to run their own agents, to build their own intelligence system. Very unusual for people to do that. And often intelligence is thought to be power, and people want to control it. Washington was comfortable about extending it that way. All of it was to be brought to him if it produced things of interest. But the intelligence began to arrive, and it started to arrive across the Delaware from what was going on in New Jersey. And what had happened was the British had great difficulties as well. This very large army was at the end of a 3,000-mile supply line. They were running short of many things. Their troops were ordered to be dispersed across the Jersey countryside and to forage upon the countryside. And the foraging left to pillaging, and the pillaging became robbery, and the robbery became rape, and the rape became murder. And the people of New Jersey began to rise in small groups, little risings in various parts of New Jersey against their oppressors. And Washington's new intelligence network was very aware of all this. It brought all that information into those open councils of war, and they began to see an opportunity of striking at some of these exposed garrisons that were already at war with the people of New Jersey, who had just a few weeks earlier had been tempted to sign those amnesty agreements with General Howe's officers. And Washington did something else. He had to find a way for his soldiers, still inexperienced, to fight those highly professional opponents, and he invented new tactics for them. One thing that Americans had in considerable abundance was artillery. There were lots of guns around. These had been mounted on American merchant vessels. And under Henry Knox, the Americans created a much larger ratio of guns to infantry. And the guns were used as assault weapons, much in the way that 19th and 20th century armies would begin to do later. And those guns amongst the infantry steadied the infantry, and they could begin to stand against these very skilled professional opponents. And you know what happened after that. Washington, once he did this, consulted with his council of war, and they agreed that they would make an attempt on Trenton, and they would throw everything they had into it. He'd raised the size of his army up to something like 6,000 men, 5,000 to 6,000 men. And he decided that on Christmas Day they would cross the Delaware, not in one place, but in 4 places. And they would converge, one group 10 miles north of Trenton, another 10 miles to the south, a third group that would go at Trenton Landing, almost at the town itself. And then there was to be another crossing from Philadelphia, and all of them to converge on at least one Hessian garrison. And as they did that and made their plans, everything went wrong again. But as they also were talking about these problems, they began to study ways of dealing with these difficulties. One was that the weather changed. As we come into late December, a great winter storm descended on the Delaware, on the Delaware River. And of all of those crossings, only one succeeded, and that was the one that Washington himself led, 10 miles north of Trenton, about 2,400 men. And they managed to get onto the, after long delay, they intended to attack just at dawn or even a little bit before dawn, hoping to win tactical surprise that way. And they were so much delayed that they were going to be attacking in the day, in about 8 o'clock. And it was thought that it almost certainly would fail. They knew that the Hessians were not the Hessians that we read about in the textbooks. They'd not been celebrating Christmas. They were not drunk. They'd been, one of the 3 regiments was always on duty. The others were sleeping in their cartridge belts, if you could imagine that. And they were prepared, but there was something that went wrong on the American side. One small group attacked without orders too soon. The Hessians had actually got word of something like that happening, and they thought that that was the American attack, and they let their guard down just for a moment after that. and it happened to be the moment when the Americans arrived. And the Hessians fought back with great courage and great skill. There were, in fact, one could say that there were 3 attacks, 3 counterattacks, and the Hessians suffered very heavy casualties. The Americans, not so heavy. Washington got them under cover, protected, being very careful with the lives of their men. And he captured about 2/3 of the Hessian garrison, about 900 men. And then after that, other things began to develop up and down the river. The British were very quick to respond and started to send their troops in motion in the direction of Trenton. The Americans took their Hessian captives back across the river, and as they did, they were very careful to follow orders, instructions from Washington that these Hessian men were to be treated with humanity. He used that word, and he meant it partly to demonstrate to invite others to surrender as well. But it took the Hessians completely by surprise. He could have done to them as the Hessians had did to some of his men at Fort Washington. But he didn't do that. And that idea of humanity began to circulate as well. And then something else happened. Washington, when he took his Hessian captives and his own men back across the Delaware, he had trouble with the discipline of his army. The Hessians were sober at Trenton, but the American army got drunk. They got into the taverns, and Washington had great difficulty getting them. The reverse crossing was very difficult. And at the same time, there was another group that had failed to make one of those earlier crossings down the river. Finally, they got across on the 27th of December, the day after the battle, the day that the other Americans were coming back across the river. And these groups from Philadelphia were the Philadelphia Associators. They were a very interesting bunch. They were very radical. The sergeants and privates had their own sergeants and privates committees. They did not hesitate to tell their officers what they should do. And when they got across to New Jersey, they had meetings, these enlisted men, and they told their officers they were not going to go back across that river. They were going to stay there. They thought there was an opportunity, and that came back to Washington, to his Council of War. He suddenly saw an opportunity, as did the entire council, and so Washington ordered his men back across the river the 29th of December, his numbers growing a little bit more, and then in this endless series of perils that happened, as he did that, the next problem that he had to deal with is that these American troops were about to run to the end of their period of enlistments. Many of them agreed to serve for a year that would expire on December 31st, just the day or 2 days after they had crossed. And Washington worked with Robert Morris, and the result of that was that they were able to find some coin buried in a rose garden by a Quaker merchant in Philadelphia. Robert Morris brought that to Washington. And Washington went to his men, and he appealed to them in the name of the cause to stay beyond their enlistment. And there was not very much enthusiasm. And then he appealed again to the cause and added $10 ready money, hard coin, and his men decided to stay on. And they occupied Trenton once more as the British came gathering, first of all, at Princeton and then down the road toward the American troops. The British outnumber the Americans about 2-1, more or less, in all of these things. Washington did 2 things. He prepared a fighting retreat with these men on the road just where we are today. This was called the Maidenhead Road that ran down to Lawrenceville, then called Maidenhead. The British getting to march down, that's about 9 miles down to Trenton. As they did, Washington had some of these men stage a fighting retreat, slowing them down, a very painful military operation, and they carried it off with much success. And at the same time, Washington had his other part of his army build field fortifications above the stream called Assunpunk Creek, which is on the south side of Trenton. And they built a layered defense of artillery and infantry lines. And as the Americans fell back, fighting all the while back on Trenton, his army was able to fill those lines, and then the British fought a battle that's been missed from the textbooks. It was the Second Battle of Trenton. And what they did was to try to cross that creek and drive the Americans out of their positions, thinking that they could do it as they had done it so often in the fighting around New York. And they failed. And there were heavy losses that this was now Cornwallis, who was back in command of the attack, that they suffered. And night came on, the Americans in their position, but now British troops streaming in, greatly outnumbering Washington. He was penned against the Delaware River, and that famous Council of War, posing a question in an open way. And people came in to describe the terrain in that area. There was what was described as a young gentleman of Princeton, maybe an undergraduate, who came in and told the Council of War about the back roads to Princeton. And Washington and his troops planned a long march around the British who were in Trenton to attack the British base at Princeton. And then hopefully they would head north to New Brunswick and capture what was there, the British field chest filled with gold. And they hoped that might help them in their recruitment efforts as well. And all that went on. In the night, half of Washington's panicked in the dark and fled down to Burlington. He took the other half up to Princeton, and very near where we are today, they ran into a British regiment along with other reinforcements that were being sent down the Maidenhead Road for the Cornwallis's troops. And there was another battle of yet another kind. This was what the soldiers call a meeting engagement. It was two armies that just ran into each other, both taken by surprise. And the British fought with great courage and suffered horrific losses. The Americans killed several hundred British troops, captured another 300 or 400. Again, Washington gave orders that they were to be treated with humanity, and it was done. And then these men were now so exhausted, they'd been marching for days. There was no hope that they could march as far as New Brunswick. So they went off in a different direction, slept by the side of the road, and then retreated to Morristown. But the campaign continued, and there were something like 60 engagements that began the next day and continued for about 3 months. And the American Army was taking the initiative in nearly all of them. They got control of the tempo. They were taking the initiative away from the British commanders. And at the end of it, the American Army was gaining in strength, and the British Army had suffered very heavy losses. They were greatly reduced in the number of their effectives. By the end of that it was called the Forage War. By the end of it, in March, the British were driven almost totally out of New Jersey. Most of the state had been recovered by the Americans. The cause had not only survived, but begun to grow again. Our man in Paris, who was then Benjamin Franklin, began to spread the news. He also spread the reports of what he called the soldier trade, and compared it to the slave trade, the soldier trade in the Hessian army. And the Americans were beginning to get control of the news, of the press, of these events, as well as of the events themselves. All of this did not win the revolution, but it kept the revolution from failing, kept it going, and it would go for a very long time, altogether longer than the American Civil War and our service in the World War II combined. That was the length of it. There were many very dark and desperate moments, but that there was this new system of an army that was made up of free men, that was led in a new way, that began to take advantage of new opportunities. How Washington did that, I would say if there's one word that would describe what he did in his councils of war, it would be that he listened. He was a listener. And it made all the difference in the way these things worked. He also, in that policy of humanity, he was aligning the values of the American Revolution to the conduct of the war. And it began to appeal to the imaginations of many people all around the world, even Washington's opponents. George III was touched by some of these things in unexpected ways. When, long after the American Revolution, George III went mad, one of the forms of his madness was to imagine that he was George Washington. And we can see something of the moral ascendancy that was beginning to happen. These men took advantage of their opportunities. They learned to do that in that much more open a way. They were very skilled, for example, at using the weather. The weather was miserable through it all. And they turned the weather to their advantage in almost each one of those campaigns. There was an old Yankee saying that some folks are weather-wise and some folks are otherwise. The American councils were weather-wise. The British councils were otherwise. And it made a difference. They learned to move quickly. It was a relative idea of speed. But General Howe said, explaining why things were going so desperately wrong, that he said, the Americans moved with more celerity than we. More celerity meant 2 miles an hour, as against perhaps 1, but it made the difference. And all of this went on in one campaign. The amazing thing to me is not that any one of these things happened, but that all of them happened together. All of them were improvised under extreme pressure and great difficulty. We think of 1776 in terms of glory and achievement. The people who were living and leading there spoke of it and remembered it as the black times of 1776, as Tom Paine called it. Robert Morris wrote to George Washington, and he said, "Thank God this year is over." He said, "I can't imagine a worse one." And George Washington agreed. And yet, in the midst of all of that, they transformed these events, and I think transformed our history. And that's something to remember. Thank you.